Thank you for joining us. I'm not a member of this panel because this is for distinguished guests, but I am going to introduce our moderator for this evening, Pastor John Lindell. So I'm going to read something, then I'm going to make a personal comment. So for those of you who don't know Pastor Lindell, John and Debbie Lindell live life full on with a passionate love for God and a desire to see His purpose unleashed in the lives of people. For the past 25 years, they have served together as lead pastors at James River Church, a dynamic, life-filled church in Ozark, Missouri that has grown to over 14,000 people in weekly attendance. John and Debbie love to see the church flourish and lives transformed by the power of God. They have 2 married sons, David and Brandon, a daughter, Savannah, and is it still 6? 8 grandchildren.
Just added 2.
2 more. May your tribe increase. And I'm going to share a personal comment. We all watch people who have large lives because of the positions that they occupy, but we all know that it's when that person is off the stage and off the platform that you see who they really are. And I just had an extraordinary opportunity this past year due to the joys of traveling out of Springfield, Missouri. You know the story I'm going to tell, where we met very early at the Springfield airport because we didn't know it, but we were on the same flight to Denver. I was going to head on to Seattle. You were headed on to, was it Oregon?
Yes.
And there was a backup, and all the flights were, you've had those days, right? Where you show up for your flight, and then you're going to spend half a day sitting in the beautiful Springfield airport. But there was a family that had actually been there since, when had they gotten there? Like 6 in the morning. And there was an adult man, a mother, elderly mother, and a third was a sister. But this was a developmentally disabled man. And they were there because he was flying back to Denver. And you could tell that the mother and the sister were very anxious because they'd been there a long time. They'd been waiting. And I just had the privilege of watching Pastor John and Debbie, complete strangers. They don't go to your church, do they? Or maybe they do. I don't know. Or they do now.
Yes, they do.
Okay. Maybe they do now. Just come alongside this family. Where are you going? It's going to be okay. We're going to stay with him. And they stayed with that family until we got on the plane. And then, I don't know if you guys rearranged your seats, but it just so happened, those just so happened moments, it just so happened that you guys sat directly across the aisle from this young man. I ended up sitting right behind him. So I watched throughout the flight, Pastor Lindell. They continued to talk with him, keep him engaged, keep him calm. The promise was, you're now going to have some time to make your connecting flight. We're going to make sure he connects with the person that's going to meet him at that. And I just watched that and I thought, no one's here recording this story. But it's moments like that you see when people are real. I mean, you know this. I don't have to tell you this, but the Lindells, they're the real deal. Also a graduate of CBC, and so now one of us. And so it is my honor to have Pastor Lindell host this evening and moderate. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, President Taylor. Well, good evening. Before our guests are seated, I'd like to introduce each one of them, and even though they in many ways need no introduction, at the same time their accomplishments, I think, not only speak for themselves but deserve recognition and merit the repetition that would come with reminding us of what they've accomplished and how God is using them. To my immediate right is Dr. Mark Hausfeld, current president of the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary, and he was serving as the director of Teen Challenge in Pakistan, 200 miles from the home of Al-Qaeda at the time of the 9/11 attacks. Dr. Hausfeld graduated from Evangel in 1980. He later earned his master's from AGTS. Mark and his wife, Linda Lesterjet, 82, class of 82, met while they were students at Evangel. Together, they have more than 30 years of ministry and education experience, both in the United States and abroad. So we welcome Dr. Mark Hausfeld. To Dr. Hausfeld's right is former Congressman, U.S. Congressman Todd Tiahrt from Kansas, Republican. He served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from 1994 to 2011. He was 1 mile from the Pentagon when the terrorists hit and was on site examining the damage early the next morning. Congressman Tiahrt was a member of the Military Construction Subcommittee, which had oversight of the reconstruction of the Pentagon. Originally from South Dakota, he graduated with a degree in business administration from Evangel in 1975 and later earned his MBA from Missouri State. Todd met his wife, Vicki Holland, class of 76, while they were students at Evangel. Today, he has a consulting business in Wichita, Kansas, Congressman Tiahrt, LLC, and advises various companies on aviation, aerospace, defense, energy issues, and government relations. Would you join me in welcoming Congressman Todd Tiahrt? Welcome tonight. And finally, on the far right, literally, Attorney General John Ashcroft. And I say that respectfully. That's good. One of the most high-profile and experienced attorneys general in the nation's history, John Ashcroft led the U.S. law enforcement community through the challenging and transformational period following the tragic attacks of September 11th, 2001. In the years to follow, his Justice Department initiated a tough anti-terrorism campaign that has assisted in disrupting more than 150 terrorist plots worldwide, dismantling terrorist cells in cities across America, and convicting 191 terrorism-related investigations. Ashcroft was raised in Springfield, Missouri, graduated from Hillcrest High School in 1960, graduated with honors from Evangel University in 1964, and received his Juris Doctor from the University of Chicago in 1967. Attorney General Ashcroft is the son of Evangel's second president, Dr. J. Robert Ashcroft. I might add, such a great man of God. And both of his brothers graduated from Evangel. Would you join me in welcoming Attorney General John Ashcroft? And gentlemen, you may be seated. I would ask you to do this if you could help us. We're recording this, so if you could turn your cell phones off or at least check and make sure that the ringer is not on, that would be very, very helpful. And I'm going to be asking some questions, and then perhaps you'll have questions that you would like to ask, and you'll notice that there are microphones in the aisle, and we'll be taking your questions as well. What a great opportunity to be able to have these men here on this platform, people who were right on scene, literally, in the events following 9/11. And I think most of us can remember, if we remember the event happening, we can remember what we were doing, where we were at, and the thoughts that flooded our mind on that day that we'll never forget. And so, Attorney General Ashcroft, I'd like to start with you. On 9/11, where were you and what were you doing on the morning of the attacks? How did you first learn of the attacks? And at what point did you realize it was a terrorist attack?
Pastor, the president had asked a number of us in the cabinet to elevate the awareness and interest in literacy in our students. So he was in Florida reading to students in Florida, and I had gotten into an airplane early that morning and left Reagan National Airport in a small government jet. I was on my way to Milwaukee to read with students, and I think we were somewhere basically between Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids, if I'm not mistaken. It was the day, frankly, was one that I would characterize as a severe clear. It was one of those days you were flying over the country. It looked just like the maps, and I don't know why it should astound me that the maps have it right, but they do. We could look down there, and the voice barked out of the cockpit area of the small jet saying, General Ashcroft, call the command center. It wasn't unusual to be asked to call the command center. Lots of things would be communicated through the command center. But they informed me in the call of the command center about the attacks. I don't remember specifically saying it, but those who were with me say that I turned to the staff members in the plane and just said, the world will never be the same. So I think we understood that something profoundly important and had changed the nature of things. We were no longer insulated with the kind of security that the oceans once provided us. And just a little more story. I'll try not to take this too long. I said to the pilot, turn this plane around and fly back to Washington, and he said, not going to do it. And I said, you're talking to the Attorney General, you know, turn this plane around. He says, we don't have enough fuel to get back to Washington. And I said, okay. So we just continued to descend over Lake Michigan and landed in Milwaukee, and a different kind of reception than we had anticipated. We were met by, you know, the SWAT teams of that community all, and with their weaponry and the like. There was so much uncertainty that people weren't taking any chances in any respect.
So how soon was it before you were back in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I said, fuel the plane up, we're going back to Washington, and I don't know, there was not any clarity about whether to fly back or not fly back. The general instruction from air traffic controllers was not to take any planes off, but I said, well, I've got to get back. So we got back in the air, and we were held up outside of Washington in a pattern until they scrambled a jet from, I think, the Richmond area to come up, and we saw the fighter pilot just appear right off the wing. And I think at the time I thought, how nice that they're going to safeguard us on the way into Washington. I think now I know that if we'd have made a wrong move on the way into Washington, someone else would be talking to you this evening, because they weren't taking any chances with airplanes entering that airspace and not being properly escorted.
How long, and one more follow-up question on that, how long does it take, or did it take the government in that scenario to have a grasp, a general grasp of what exactly had happened on that morning?
Well, Todd, you may have been a part of it. I think I gave a briefing that night about midnight up on the top of that old police station down there, down the hill from the Senate. I think we knew what had happened to us. We didn't have all the names of the operatives, but we learned pretty quickly. But when I landed, they tossed the Kevlar coat on me, and they started driving me toward the alternative site, you know, where government could have continuity in the event Washington were to be hit. And the traffic was so substantial and coagulated, congested going out of Washington, that I just said, there were people jogging down the road faster than we were moving. And I said to the FBI guys who drove me around across the median, I'm calling Condoleezza, tell her I'm not going to go to a hole in the ground. I'm going to get back there, and we're going to start working on, because we had to get planes out of the air. We had stuff coming across the Atlantic and across the Pacific past the point of no return. We didn't know whether they were going to crash into something, and some of them had little anomalies. Like when you're in an airplane, the airplane has a way of, they call it squawking a code. and each airplane is assigned a number, and that shows up on the radar and tells you which plane is which blip. And some of the things had been carelessly set, so they were squawking the wrong numbers, and we didn't know whether that was some pilot trying to signal to us that they were in distress. So our job was to get planes out of the air. And frankly, I just had dinner 2 weeks ago with one of my friends from Canada who was the Solicitor General at the time, and Canadians were so good to us. We landed a lot of planes in Canada coming across the Atlantic at places where they had no capacity to house people. And so Canadian citizens just took lots of Americans into their homes. It was just a time when there was a lot of unity expressed after 9/11 in a lot of ways that was sort of heartwarming in the midst of the rather very serious matter.
Certainly. Wow, very fascinating. Congressman Tiahrt, on the morning of 9/11, where were you at, and what was happening through the day for you as a congressman?
Pastor, thank you for taking time to do this tonight. Really appreciate you being here to guide our conversation. I got up that morning about, same time, took my kids to school. We lived in Fairfax, Virginia, probably 15 miles from the Capitol. And I left the house to go into the Capitol to a hearing of the Defense Subcommittee of Appropriations. And as I was leaving the neighborhood, I heard on the radio that a plane had crashed into one of the Twin Towers. And it was the first crash that had occurred that morning. And I thought, how odd that a plane would fly into a building when it's so clear out. Now, the Empire State Building had been, planes had flown into it in fog, and so it wasn't unusual for a plane to hit a building. But during a clear day, it seemed rather odd. And as I got a little closer to the Capitol, a little further down the road, I heard of a second plane going in. And I remember the moment that it struck me that this was an attack. The coincidence was just beyond refute. It was an attack. And so I thought I better hurry to get into the Capitol. And so I got on 395 heading into Washington, D.C. And about a mile out, I was just looking forward through the windshield, and I saw a cloud of brown dust come up just over the horizon. You go over a hill, and then you can see the Pentagon. And this brown cloud of dust, and I thought, that is so odd. What would cause that? And it was almost immediately followed by black, billowing smoke. Well, I worked for the Boeing company for 14 years as a proposal manager in Wichita, Kansas, commonly known as the air capital of the world. Boeing had a facility there, Beechcraft, Learjet, Cessna. It's very common for the firefighters in Wichita, Kansas to train on an airplane fire, so I recognized a jet fuel fire. It's that black billowing smoke. I'd seen it before when a military jet had gone down just outside of Wichita. So I knew it wasn't just an explosion. It was a plane crash, not unlike what had happened in Washington, D.C. Not long after I saw that, the traffic, in fact, almost immediately, the traffic started slowing and it came to a complete dead stop. I was probably a half a mile from the Capitol. And we were just frozen in place. They had locked down the District of Columbia, so you couldn't get across the bridge, across the Potomac River to get into the Capitol. And I sat there for probably an hour. You couldn't get any phone conversation. I couldn't get a hold of my staff. I couldn't get a hold of my wife. It was very frustrating. At that time, of course, we had these big old Motorola phones that weighed about 10 pounds. And I remember that they gave us Blackberries after that for our protection. I thought, how can a Blackberry protect me? They should make it out of Kevlar and put it on a necklace so at least hang over my heart. If somebody shot me right there, it'd stop it. But because the thing didn't work, when there's all that chatter on there. So finally, I got through to my wife and told her that I was okay. And eventually, we all turned around one at a time on the interstate, and we went backwards. And we got off. It took me about 4 hours to get back home. Able to go into Washington, D.C. And as a member of the military subcommittee, I met up with the chairman, a guy named David Hobson from Ohio, and we went to the Pentagon. The Pentagon has 5 rings. there's 5 sides and 5 rings. The outside ring is the E ring, and that's the offices that are in that all the way around. The next one is the D ring. The third ring is the C ring, and then B and A, and then there's what they call ground zero in the middle. At the E ring was just completely devastated. There's a big gap in it, like a valley, and it was smoldering still, and there was a lot of unusual things about that. There was one office that was exposed to the outside, had a Bible open sitting on a desk that was still there after all the firefighting and after the explosion and the fire and everything. That Bible was still there. I didn't see that personally, but we talked to people who were there from the Pentagon that actually came to our committee and explained what went on to the damage and told us that miracle had occurred. It makes you wonder how God works sometimes. The D ring, the next ring in, also had a crevice in it, but the C ring only had a hole that was about 20 feet high and maybe 15 feet across. It was just like a big arc, a hole in the side of the building, and inside that was the front landing gear of an airplane. Now, I worked at the Boeing company. I can tell you what a front landing, estimated them, we proposed them to the United States Air Force. It was a front landing gear of an airplane. I've heard of a lot of conspiracy theories about how a rocket was fired by our own government into the Pentagon to start the conflict. And I even had people tell me that in Wichita, Kansas, and I said, no, I was there. I saw the front landing gear. So there was a lot of chaos during that day, and we started piecing things together the following day. But the unity, I just want to mention one thing about unity, and then I'll give it back to you. We experienced something that I haven't seen since. I hadn't seen it before. We probably hadn't experienced it since either the Korean War or World War II, and that's the period of unity, where the country thinks as one, where the Congress acts as one. And it was the following 6 weeks from September 11th, 2001. It seems to me that it's a crisis that often brings us together as a nation. And we are people of good nature and of good heart. We don't always act like it. We don't always let our better angels speak. But it's out there somewhere, and it's institutions like Evangel that give us the tools to recognize it and encourage it and bring it into our culture. So I'm glad to be a graduate of this university and to be part of this event tonight.
Well, thank you so much. That is fascinating. Let me ask you this. Did security increase for congressional members, or how during that time, was there special security that was afforded to you?
Yes, we got a lot of special security. They gave us an 800 number to call. There's this one guy who had come to my office, and he was he'd been coming to my office, and we called to the Sergeant of Arms office. When you're a member of Congress, the House floor is governed by the Sergeant of Arms. They also take care of the members when they're elected. When you're not elected, they don't care about you, but when you're elected, so if you have anything problem happening, you're supposed to call them. So at my office in Wichita, Kansas, there was this guy named Roger, who was he was a laid-off railroad worker who had been given disability because of I think he was on some kind of a mental problem, disability, and he kept coming in. I mean, he did strange things. He went down to the post office and had all my official congressional mail forwarded to his house. So it took us a while to get that straightened out. But, so...
He did you a favor.
He did me a favor, yeah. So before 9/11, I complained to the Sergeant at Arms about this. This guy's harassing my staff and everything, and nothing happened. But a week afterward, he came back, and my staff called the Sergeant at Arms, and he got arrested. So they did increase our security by trying to take care of anybody that was acting. The BlackBerry and on our 800 number.
Very interesting. Dr. Hausfeld, you were in Pakistan, and so that is a totally different perspective that would come your way with an event like 9/11. Talk a little bit about what that was like.
Well, I happened to be in Kiev seminary board meeting, Evangel Theological Seminary, which is in a sense about school. Now I'll juggle. And so I was acting as an area director for Assemblies of God World Missions, and so the other area directors, we were in Kiev, Ukraine, for this board meeting, actually being led by Dr. Robert Cooley. And we came to the conclusion of our day, which was at 4 p.m., and we were going to head back to where we were staying. I just happened to stay with the president of the seminary. And as we came out of our board meeting, the president came out of his office and he said, one of our missionaries has called and said that a plane has flown into one of the World Trade Center buildings. And something in me immediately knew it was not just an accident. As you said, planes have flown into the Empire State Building, things such as that, like during World War II, but I thought there's no way with avionics. My father's a pilot, and there's no way that this could have just been something that randomly happened. And I remember saying to the secretary, this is going to come back to our part of the world. And so we left, we went back to the president's apartment, we turned on the television, of course, we went to CNN, and seeing that tower smoking, and then the other one hit and smoking as well, it was like watching a terror movie. It was like watching something out of Hollywood. It was just unreal. But my first thought was, well, my wife and my 3 children are back in Islamabad, Pakistan, as well as a number of other missionaries that were in Pakistan, and we had also then evacuated a number of our AGW missionaries out of Afghanistan because the Taliban were closing in on them and wanting to arrest them, and they just barely escaped before 9/11. So all of this stuff was in the works. And so we knew that New York was the fruit, but we knew the root would come back to where we were.
What was it like as an American in Islamabad in the days following 9/11?
The Pakistani people were wonderful. They told us how sorry they were. Many were crying. We had house help that were Afghans. They were crying. We didn't run into one Muslim person in Pakistan that rejoiced over what happened. They couldn't believe it. They were horrified by it.
So were radicals operating in Pakistan at that time to the degree that maybe they did later, or were the more radical elements of Islam centered in Afghanistan at that time?
Well, our home was just about 4 blocks away from the Taliban embassy. And we had run into those fellows quite a bit, and a real darkness about them, a deep, deep darkness. You look into their eyes and it just looked black. And so they represent very much a minority of extremists. And of course, since 9/11, Pakistan has in many ways become unhinged, and extremism is rampant throughout different parts of the country, but it's again a minority that's controlling and doing those kinds of efforts. I've had Pakistani people warn me about going certain places, and I count them as saving my life, as well as our family. We even have a missionary here that was our mentor in Pakistan, and she was with us when we eventually evacuated a week later.
Interesting. Well, thank you for your service for the gospel to the people of Pakistan. And really, it's so fascinating to hear the stories that Dr. Hausfeld has to share relative to that. General Ashcroft, no doubt when you get into a crisis, the magnitude of 9/11, that rearranges priorities. So maybe looking back, were there things on your agenda that you wish you could have done but were not able to accomplish because 9/11 redirected your priorities?
it's a strange sort of thing. The president had really talked to me earlier about reducing the amount of gun violence in the culture. And his philosophy was, and mine happened to be as well, that the way you do that is prosecute gun crime, not necessarily proliferate gun laws, because we've got plenty of gun laws, that's my view. Just need to prosecute the people. So we were working on that. Prior to 9/11, we were working on immigration prior to 9/11, because the Mexican government has an idea that it wants immigration, how it wants immigration to operate, and that it doesn't want open borders. If it had open borders, the very best people in Mexico might leave. They don't want a brain drain. What they want is an ability of people to go back and forth, because the number one currency value for Mexico comes from people in the United States sending money back, and they want people to go back and reacquaint themselves with their home and that kind of stuff, so that so those issues were front and center. When 9/11 hit, it refocused us in a very substantial way toward counterterrorism. But there's a kind of interesting thing, that the anti-drug program which we wanted to implement, the anti-gun crime program which we wanted to implement, a whole variety of things like that, as a result of a new sobriety in the community, I think in the nation as a whole. So we ended up with the lowest incidence of guns used in violent crimes that they had on record. And there are a whole series of sort of remediations that would be sort of you wouldn't anticipate. You think you're directing your attention somewhere else. But I think there was a sobriety that came to the American culture, and this sort of sense of unity that Todd talked about. One of the pictures of unity that really struck me was that under the highway overpasses in Washington, at least at that time, there were people living in refrigerator cartons in the street, people. And all of a sudden, American flags were appearing on the sides of those refrigerator cartons. That meant that there was a substantial array of unity, from the very top of the culture down to the people at the very lowest level. Everybody felt like this is a time to put together. So, yeah, there are things that probably we didn't spend as much time on, but in some respects, some of those things, some of those challenges were remediated, some of those problems were solved in ways that they might not have been solved had we not had the unity and the kind of sobriety that came to the culture. I mean, I don't know whether you felt a surge at your congregation, but people went to church for a while, and I think when they went into the churches, they heard things and began to think about things that were healthy for the culture. So, and some of the rates of crime went down at a time when we thought, well, if we'd have been focused on that, maybe we wouldn't have had the same success.
When you look at the present security apparatus and what has happened as a reaction to 9/11 and the steps that were in fact necessary to protect the American people and in many respects the world, as you look at it now, where it's at now, do you feel like on the spectrum of not enough, too much, or in the center, just right? What would your personal perspective be on that?
Well, I think we've had a great blessing in the country. We've come more than a decade now without very substantial similar attack in the United States. And the downside risk of doing a little too much, there may be some risk there, but there's a really big downside risk of doing too little. And so I think we wanted to err on the side of getting the job done. When the president, he was in Florida the day of the event, and then he, I think, was held outside the city for the rest of that day in the evening to make sure that, well, he shouldn't be there if the city might be under attack. The next day he returned and looked in my direction and said, "Don't ever let there's a lesson for me in that. Clarity is a great part of leadership, and it wasn't, it'd be a good idea if you would try to do your best, to try and I went back to the Justice Department and I said, we've got to think outside the box, but we can't ever think outside the Constitution. Because, if you don't like what you're getting, you're going to have to change what you're doing. I think the business department here at the university would have the saying, your system is perfectly designed to give you what you're getting. And if you want to change what you're getting, you have to change the system. So we had to make some changes. My grandfather was an immigrant from Norway. And he said, Jan, I sawed this board off 4 times and it's still too short. Well, if you don't like what you're getting, change what you're doing. So we had to make some changes. And one of the things that I think we have to understand, though, is that the threat is not static. The threat's dynamic. They're making changes all the time, and we have to be alert. I mean, just the availability and the utility of the internet a decade ago is different than it is now. And the existence of ISIS is different than the existence of Al-Qaeda. That they rely on literally a different religious base. And so the challenges may require, but one last quick point. I always over-answer, but I was in the Senate, so I keep talking. People want to say, well, how much liberty are you willing to sacrifice for security? I don't see security and liberty as being competitive values. I think liberty is the core value. It's the supreme value. I think it's what God gave us as a value. And the purpose of security is to enhance liberty. So I don't think liberty competes with security. I think it supports, it supports liberty. And there are, am I more free now that I have to go through security at airports? Maybe I'm not as free as I was in 1950 when you could dance out onto the tarmac if you wanted to, or ride your bike out there. But that's not the question. Would I be freer today if there were no security at airports? I wouldn't be. I left New York after being at a board meeting today. I left there at a little after noon. And I went through security a couple times to get here, but I felt much more free to travel given that. So the purpose of security is to enhance liberty and to make it workable. And I think there's relatively good performance on the part of the American public. The last point I would make, as I told the president, and I told many of the people in the Justice Department, except the Lord guards the city, the watchman watches in vain. We ought to thank God that we have not been the victims of additional attacks, and I pray that we won't.
Well, I want to thank you, and as a citizen of this country, for the measures you took as Attorney General to protect this country, to protect the citizens of this country, because many of those measures really are the framework of our present-day security and have, in fact, kept us from experiencing another attack on our soil. So thank you so much for what you've done.
There were short-term things we had to do, and then there were long-term things we had to do. In the short term, we didn't know what had happened to us. We really weren't clear about what might be follow-on and like. So we took some measures. I ordered the interviewing of about 10,000 people who were here with known citizenship in terrorist-sponsoring countries. And there was a lot of criticism that I sent all kinds of law enforcement out, FBI, all the guys from the Justice Department, the U.S. Marshals, the FBI, the DEA, everybody we could gather together to interview these people so that if they knew something, it could help us default something. And also so that there would just be what I called noise in the system. If anyone was out there thinking about doing something, I wanted them to think, this wouldn't be a good time. Then we began to get more structural things in place, including some of the authorities that came in the Patriot Act and the like. Very good. Well, thank you. Congressman Tiahrt, given the changes of 9/11 and the world in which we live today, having served in Congress gives you really a unique perspective. What
what would you want the American people to understand about the war on terror and relative to their participation in government, and your thoughts on that?
I think probably the biggest lesson that I personally learned that I'd want the American public to understand is that leadership really does matter. If you look at how we approached the threat of terrorism, not only here in the United States, but globally, we had very clear goals under the Bush administration that we worked towards. And you heard in John's bio about how many different terrorist acts were thwarted because of those very clear goals that we followed to an end. And they had people trying to blow up the Mackinac Island Bridge in Michigan, and remote areas where they were trying to take terrorist activities to try to make us feel threatened in our own homes. But that leadership was very important because of these good, clear goals that the administration had that were supported by Congress, and we moved towards. And I think in the last 8 years, and I understand that I am a Republican, so there's some bias about having a Republican president versus a Democrat president, and I'll acknowledge that. But I don't think that we've had that kind of clear leadership in the last 8 years. And I think it's caused us to be more vulnerable, not so much in our own country, although we have seen much more terrorist attacks, but globally, we don't seem to have the same unified direction by free countries and free democracies and free economies. And that's where why I think we're seeing the proliferation of ISIS and the expansion of Al-Qaeda in parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan. We just don't have the same clear objectives of keeping our world safe and free and clear of these kind of dangers. So in this process, what I think American people should think about, especially as they approach an election, is that where do you get good, clear, strong leadership, and how do you keep that in perspective? I know in this whole, I've been involved in politics for a long time, like John has. I was a Republican National Committeeman from Kansas until last July following the convention. So I was very engaged in the process of selecting the nominee. And we have a nominee today that was probably my 17th choice. We had 17 people running and he was 17th choice. But he's the candidate today. And I fully support him and I'm going to vote for him because of the two choices that we have. He displays the kind of good, clear leadership that I think will get people focused, our military focused, our administration, whoever the Attorney General will be, and I hope it's you again, John. Get them focused on keeping our country safe and our people safe. And so I think that through that process, and there are other examples. I mean, if you look at the degradation of our culture, it kind of started back in the 90s when we went through this constant barrage of controversy after controversy after controversy in the Clinton administration. And it just degraded the mean level of our culture. It started decaying back then, and I see it still continue on that path of decay. And it'll probably be some catastrophic event that brings us back together and back to as a nation, back to faith. I hate to think that. I hate to say that. It could be a political catastrophe. It could be an economic catastrophe. It could be a natural disaster. But it probably will take something catastrophic to bring Americans back to their knees and the average American back to their faith. And that worries me. But if we're going to make a world that's safe, where we protect the liberty that we so deserve, that was our birthright, we're going to have clear leadership and strong leadership and stay focused on what the real problems are, not the controversies, but the problems.
Very good. We're going to open it up for questions after this question to Dr. Hausfeld. And so be thinking about your questions. You have the perspective as somebody who's lived in the Middle East. You're familiar with aspects of Islam that I don't think most Americans have the understanding, obviously, that you would have. As an educator, post 9/11, what is it that you feel would be the important lessons to instill in students or in those you visit with to shape their perspective in the world as we move forward, especially relating to the Muslim world?
Well, I think it's important that, especially the body of Christ, the global body of Christ, not live in elements of fear and anger and indifference towards Muslim people. Before I became president of the seminary, I was the international director for Global Initiative Reaching Muslim Peoples for AG World Missions. And no matter where we traveled to 43 different locations to equip and mobilize the church to reach Muslims, not just pastors and missionaries, but lay people in the church too. Even in Cuba, we started training Cubans how to do this in Havana and other places in Cuba. But the global church seems to carry a sense of fear and anger towards Muslims. And I think that one of the things we have to realize is that this is the greatest religion in size outside of Christianity. And I do believe there's an end time connection to that, because Islam is political, it is economic, it is military, it is religious. It wraps up into one. And I believe if the enemy would have us be deceived in any area, it would be that we would retreat from engaging Muslims, particularly those that are in context of freedom like the United States and in Europe, even growing in South America, because I believe God is moving peoples, according to Acts 17 verses 26 and 27, that God is moving people to different places at different times so that the church can engage them with the gospel. I believe that we get excited about the missionary going to Cairo, but we don't get as excited about the Muslim from Cairo moving in next door, when I believe God has ordained them and brought them here so that we as the body of Christ, especially a Pentecostal people who are all about harvesting, should be thinking about how we're going to engage them. I'm telling more and more pastors, and I just was in Austin, Texas, and spoke at the Austin section ministers gathering, and they wanted to talk about Islam in the United States and the local church. And I said, if your missiology is limited to how much you're giving a missionary per month and where you're going to take your next missions trips, that's not a missiology. God is bringing the world into context of freedom, and a large number of those people are Muslims, so that the body of Christ in freedom can be equipped and mobilized, empowered by the Holy Spirit to engage them with the gospel. So we need to be thinking in the United States like missionaries. We need to be contextualizing. We need to be finding out where the lost are and specifically reaching out to them.
Fabulous. Well said. We want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. We would ask that you come to the mic, that you state your name and where you're from, and then direct your question to the person that you would like to answer that. So feel free to do that.
Hello, my name's John Spence, and I'm from here in Springfield, Missouri. One of the questions I wanted to ask was for either Congressman Tiahrt or Attorney General Ashcroft concerning the legislation that not only was recently produced, but also Congress worked to override President Obama's veto, allowing the victims or the families of victims of 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia. And the question is, how do you feel like that will affect foreign relations with Saudi Arabia? And also, how do you feel that we as Christians should respond to that legislation? Thank you.
Spence was your last name. What was your first name again? John. John, that's a very good question, and I don't think there's a clear answer in my mind about that. What is at risk? I mean, the first thought of would you allow these families who have had a tragedy occur to them because of a group of people, 19 individuals that were funded by somebody? If they were funded by Saudi Arabia, should we allow them to sue Saudi Arabia for their loss? That's kind of the question behind this. And I think the natural response is, of course, there was a wrongful death here because of terrorism, and someone's responsible because they wrote a check or they transferred a bank account, they provided a means for this to happen. The risk is that if the opportunity occurs for us to sue other governments as individuals, as citizens, then other citizens in other countries will have the opportunity to sue our troops or our embassies or our people. So that's the question. Do we allow these handful of families go after the people in Saudi Arabia because maybe our government didn't hold them accountable like they should have? Or should we protect our men and women in uniform? So it becomes a little more murky, because my first response was I would support that legislation. I would support that veto override. And then as I processed it, I thought, my neighbor is a military person. He lives right across the street from me in Alexandria, Virginia, when I'm in Virginia. And he's been in Iraq a couple of times, and he's been in Afghanistan once. And he's getting ready to go back somewhere that he can't talk about. Do I want somebody in Iraq or somebody in Afghanistan or maybe somebody in Europe who feels like they have had some atrocity against him to haul him to a court in Brussels and sue him for everything he's worth? And if we do, then as a country, do we protect him? Do we provide legal counsel to him? And so I came to the conclusion, I'm not so sure it's a good idea. And I probably would have not, had the opportunity, if I had the opportunity to vote on it, I would have not overrode the president's veto. But what's your opinion about that, John? You get a yay or a nay. What is it?
I wasn't a member of the Congress, so I wouldn't have, I was at one time. I was in I think you've stated the problem very, very clearly. And for instance, if we use one of those missiles to extinguish some terrorists and there's collateral damage, or we're doing something else in the war on terror and there are people who are injured, should the United States be susceptible to suits? I haven't read the legislation. I don't know the details of it, but the various considerations have been well articulated by the congressman, and I think those are the concerns. I do know that the idea that people are able to sue leaders of governments and to call them to account is very troublesome. The Belgians, for instance, developed an idea that they were going to be able to remedy virtually any injustice in the world. So they had warrants out for Vice President Cheney and I think the senior President Bush, based on the first war, Desert Storm. And the idea that not that they would necessarily prevail in the suit, but if our people have to have their depositions taken, have to go stand trial. And the Belgians, I think, eventually came to the conclusion that, hey, we're the capital of NATO. If we make it impossible for the officials of the United States government to come over here without being sued, maybe that's not in our best judgment. So these are very complex issues. I think in an election year like this, it's pretty easy to say, let's go get those terrorists and anybody that was associated with them, and there are plenty of things to be unhappy with the Saudis about. But whether or not those things should be left between nation states rather than having individual citizens involved, there were some substantial indemnifications paid by the United States of America to people whose injuries were sustained in the 9/11 setting. I had a responsibility to oversee some of that, and it was hundreds of millions of dollars. And there was a real effort made to try and help people recover actual damages. But I think what people would like to do is to try and get punitive sorts of damages from Saudi Arabia. And at that point, punishing a nation state, this would be new in history. Usually when nation states sought to be punished, other nation states got mad enough about it, they went and punished them, so to speak. That's how wars start. And So I think there's some real value in understanding the ambivalence and the difficult issues that just aren't the emotional response. Go ahead and sock them with a suit.
Very good. Question on this mic?
Congressman Tiahrt, you seem to be talking about the inevitable moving to a second 9/11. I was wondering if any of the panels might talk about what we can do in America to make changes that are needed to avoid moving to the shock of a second 9/11 to bring America around to where we need to be.
Second 9/11, thank you for the question. And I think we're not going to see something similar to what we saw in 2001. I think we're going to see a more ISIS-influenced individual acts that are either coordinated or supported or sustained ideologically in our malls, in our airports, in our schools, on our streets. And I think the best way for us as Americans to try to avoid that or prepare that is to make sure that the people who are in the political process, in law enforcement, engage communities, engage Muslims in our country, because they are probably more aware of who is becoming radicalized than we can identify them. They'll have a higher chance of identifying them. There are 4 mosques in Wichita, Kansas. I was shocked when I found that out. They've been there for over 10 years. I didn't realize we had so many Muslims in a community that of 500,000 people. One of the mosques is visible, so I thought there was only one. It was built by Saudi Arabia. It's a huge building, and it's as big as any of our largest churches. So, and we've heard rumors about what they're teaching in their madrasas and everything. But if our law enforcement, and this includes the federals as well as the locals, are engaged in that community and participate in their community events, we'll have a much better idea of knowing who is being tilted towards radicalization, who is out there trying to purchase guns. You know, when you look at what happened in Southern California, the next door neighbor thought something was funny going on, but she failed to report it because she didn't want to be labeled as a racist. So if she is comfortable in talking about this to local law enforcement, or if local law enforcement has a good enough relationship with the community that they get a little feedback and can check those things out, we have a lot higher percentage chance of being safe in our community. So, I have friends that are Muslims, and my wife is on Facebook a lot. Some of you know that. I see Terry Hoggart over here. I think he knows. But she is in touch with people who are Muslims on Facebook and talks about these things openly. And I think as American citizens, we need to be open to Muslim people. I probably have a prejudice just because of all that's happened in my life, and especially the last 2001, September 11, 2001 had a big impact on me. But I am trying to overcome my own personal prejudices to make friends with people who are Muslims. And I think we need to do that as evangelicals and as American citizens, because being in touch with the community is our best way to approach safety, I think, in the future. Because we're not going to see I don't think we'll see a catastrophic attack like we did on September 11th, 2001. I think we're going to see individual acts of terror inspired by ISIS-style lone wolves or people that are, maybe acting 2s and 3s, driving a car into a crowd, getting a gun and shooting up a group of friends that are at a company meal. And those are the kinds of things that we'll probably see in the future. But being a friend, expanding your friendship into a different part of the community, and encouraging political people and law enforcement officers to be engaged in their communities where they know that these type of radical ideas are floating around.
Well, thank you very much, panelists. It's been really wonderful to be able to hear each one of you, and has given us a lot to think about. I think especially as a pastor, we want to see the kingdom advance. We know we're headed toward the end times, but we want to take as many people as we can with us to heaven. We want to share the gospel. I'm thankful for Evangel University. Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for making this possible. What a gift to the community. And we appreciate so much having this as a part of the homecoming activities. And so thank you so much for coming tonight. Would you show our panelists your appreciation tonight? Thank you so much for being with us.